let me introduce myself. I'm James Bach. I run Statusvice Incorporated. I am the CEO and principal consultant at Statusvice. I like to call myself a consulting software tester in the same vein that Sherlock Holmes called himself a consulting detective. Michael, say something about yourself.
I'm Michael Bolton. I am a co-author of an approach to testing called rapid software testing with a guy named James Bach. I work under the business name of DevelopSense, and I have been training people in testing and acting as a test consultant for many years now, as evidenced by the gray in the beard and the loss of the hair.
And we're talking today with James Christie.
Hi, yes. My background is originally in accounting before I switched into IT development because that seemed more interesting. I took 6 years out in the middle of my career to work as an IT auditor for a major UK insurance company before returning to frontline IT work in development and then test management. And I also spent a few years while I was working for IBM as an information security manager on large outsourced accounts. So I've got all-round experience of IT auditing and being audited, which gives me fairly strong opinions on the matter. I've seen it done well and I've seen it done badly.
Well, this is what I want to talk about today is the subject of auditing. I have never officially been an auditor. I've done some auditing like things. I'm involved in a project right now where the company that hired me is concerned that they may be using sensitive customer data in testing, which in their case is illegal for them to use. And so they've called me in to look at their test process and see if I can find any evidence of sensitive customer data in their test process. All the testers already know there shouldn't be, but my goal is to look at all of their processes, all of their data, every bit of documentation they have, every bit of all their historical records, anything I want to look at. I've been given a free hand to
Mhm.
comb through it and interview them and examine everything I can, looking for any evidence that there might be sensitive customer data and to comment on their processes about that. So it's if I feel that that's something similar to
Yeah,
auditing, but it might not be. It may or may not be what you do as an auditor. But I think they feel about me the way people feel about an auditor coming in, and you know the sense of, uh-oh, I think I'm okay, but who knows what this outsider is gonna think when he comes in and looks over my shoulder and judges me.
yeah. People can be much too defensive, and they can do daft, unnecessary things, thinking that the auditors will be focused entirely on the process, on mass detail, rather than thinking about what the whole point of the exercise is.
So
And
I want to present a scenario to you which is very common, uh which involves a very common sentiment, a common uh idea that people have about a regulated test process, and I'd like you to comment on it. If I go into a medical device project, I'm bound to find someone there who will say, "Oh, but James, in medical device testing, you are not allowed to do any testing unless it is fully documented. We have to define test cases for all the testing we do. It must be documented in this format that years ago a consultant gave us, and it must be documented in that format because we are regulated and we're not free to do that exploratory stuff that you talk about, where the tester just interacts with the product in real time and learns about it and investigates it. We're not allowed to do that because we are regulated and the auditor won't accept that. So that is a
Well,
common sentiment that I hear. What do you say?
yeah. Well, you're talking about what the FDA requires, probably. They wouldn't,
That's what this
and
company will tell
yeah,
me. They'll say, "Oh
but
yes, the
but
FDA
does
requires us to document everything that we do."
well does the FDA actually say that? I would suspect not. I suspect they're more focused on the act. I haven't looked at their stuff for a few years, but when I did, um, they were clearly much more pragmatic and sensible, and they're focused more on the principles rather than the detailed prescriptive list of how you must do it.
Whenever
So
anybody says that to me, my experience is that they're not familiar with, I think it's item 2 in the guidance for medical device testing from the FDA, which is the principle of the least burdensome approach to start with.
Yep, yeah. I'll have a look.
There's also an assumption that everything that happens that is test related must be formalized. But there's a problem with that because all good formal testing must begin with informal testing. I mean, to what degree of formalization and at what point in the process of testing can this reasonably be introduced? You know, it can't formalize the fact that, well, okay, I'm going to intend to try this thing on the product. And I'm going to intend to write about it. And I'm going to write about my intention to intend about writing about it. It does seem to be a bit of a infinite regress at that point.
the
Uh,
if you're asking about the federal regulations, what the FDA says is based on the federal regulations. So the federal regulations that are involved is 21 CFR Part 820, and specifically subsection 30 of that. And all down there, they have statements about what you have to do. And for instance, paragraph G in that section is, but what it says is design validation. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for validating the device design. Design validation shall be performed under defined operating conditions on initial production units, lots, or batches, or their equivalents. Design validation shall ensure that devices conform to defined user needs and intended uses, and shall include testing of production units under actual or simulated use conditions. Design validation shall include software validation and risk analysis where appropriate. The results of design validation, including identification of the design methods, the date, the individuals performing the validation, shall be documented.
In the DHF, in the design history file.
Yeah, it shall be documented. So what it says is, seems pretty clear. It says, hey, you've got to validate your design and you need to define how you're going to do that, and then you need to document how you did that. That's pretty clear. The
mhm.
word test case doesn't show up at all.
Yep. No.
Uh the and not the word test procedure itself doesn't show up, but clearly the procedures by which we do this must be documented. And it seems to me the spirit of that statement is that if you tell us that this thing solves a certain problem, then you need to show us evidence that it solves that problem. And you need to show us
Yeah.
sufficient evidence that it does so.
Yeah, evidence, evidence, evidence. It's what an auditor is going to expect. Evidence that shows that you've taken the problem seriously, that you've done a good job, and you can demonstrate that. You need to be able to show that you have a consistent approach to testing, and it's not just up to individuals winging it any way they feel like it. And that consistent approach could well involve, or should involve, exploratory testing, as far as I'm concerned. But an auditor should expect to see an overarching test strategy. This is how we test in this organization. And then a plan that's relevant to the particular problem. This is how we're going to apply that for this particular product or system. And then evidence to show this is what we did, and this is what we found, this is what we learned. When
That,
you
I
read
think,
out,
is the spirit of it. That's the spirit of it.
well, yeah,
Now,
because
someone could hear that though, and they could say, "Well, James, this is saying exactly what I said already, which is that you must document all your testing. We've got to stick to our documented test cases." And what I tell them is that is a logical fallacy that you are laboring under because
Mhm.
because let me lead you through it. If you did all the testing that the auditor was expecting and required, and the auditor was perfectly happy with that. Let's imagine that situation, and it's all documented to the nth degree. It's documented as much as anyone could ever want or expect. Let's say that that is true. But let's say it's also true that last weekend, just for fun, you did some extra testing. You held a testing party above and beyond everything that you needed to do. You did some testing purely for the sake of enjoying the process of testing, and you didn't write any of that stuff down. You didn't write down the outcomes or the processes you used or anything. And let's say that the auditor finds out about it. Is the auditor going to say, "Whoa, you gave me everything I could possibly want, but then I just found out that you did 5 hours of optional additional fun testing that wasn't documented. I can't let you ship this product." That would be absurd. That would be
Yep.
absurd. The auditor is going to say, "I don't care what extra stuff that you did. I got everything that I needed. You did everything you had to do. You're telling
Well,
me that you did some extra things on top of that? I don't care. It doesn't matter." That's what it seems to me is the case. Do you
well,
agree or
I
not?
would care if there was something useful that was learned that should have been documented. I'd be a bit disappointed if that work was done and was nothing learned from it.
Oh,
I'd
let's
I'd hope that
does
people
it
would
matter? Does it matter whether I learn from and get benefit from something that was purely optional and above and
yeah,
beyond
hey,
every
but
single thing that the
I
auditor
think
needed?
what's the point? Is the point compliance, or is the point to ship the best product and show that we've learned as much as we can about it? That's the sort of thing that auditors
Does it
should
well,
have a should.
what do you mean when you say what's the point? Do you mean what was the point of the testing party, the drunken testing party that we had last
No,
week?
no. What's the point of testing? If the point of testing is simply to demonstrate compliance, that's a very limited understanding of what testing should do. It's a very limited understanding of compliance as well.
Well,
Point
uh,
is to, as you know, it's to learn about the product. And
I
if people are,
agree with you.
but if people are something that we would be hard on as auditors as if we thought people were simply following the process with no interest or understanding of what the purpose was.
Well, be that as it may, it's outside the scope of the specific thought experiment that I'm proposing. I am proposing that a scenario where the auditor has received absolutely everything they require. They're happy. And
Mhm.
then it comes to light that there was extra stuff on top of that that was done for testing
Mhm.
that didn't show up in any of the documented materials, which were already completely adequate in the mind of the auditor and in the mind of the organization. And no, there was no lies. There were no omissions with respect to all the testing that needed to be done to fulfill the spirit and the letter of all of the regulations. Okay, and then it comes to light that a tester got drunk one night, broke into the test lab and did extra testing for fun with his friends. Even found bugs, and then some drunk developers just fixed the bugs. But none of it was documented.
I think we'd be more concerned about allowing drugs into this computer installation.
So the my
Yeah,
point is
yeah,
the auditor is not going to be concerned about any extra stuff that you do above and beyond. Or I mean, we can
no,
even have a more ridiculous thought experiment. Like, what if a tester, while off duty, thought about how to test the product and got some ideas, but didn't document that they had been thinking about testing when they were off duty, and they only acted on those ideas when they were on duty again the following day. I mean, it would be absurd to say that the law says that everything you do in testing must be documented. That's not what the law says. The law says that you must have a process, you must have evidence, you must
mhm,
document the process, you must document the evidence, but it's only referring to the evidence that provides a basis for your contention that this product is safe and effective. It's not all possible evidence that you might be acting on. It's the evidence that you are presenting as your case that you are making. It's kind of similar to presenting a case to a jury in a court case and then also saying to a jury, oh, in addition to all the evidence that you have to consider, I'll add this. I personally think my client is innocent. The fact that the lawyer thinks his client is innocent is irrelevant to the jury. It's not part of the evidence that they have to consider. Uh, and similarly, if I do extra testing, well, that's not part of the evidence that the auditor needs to be concerned about. The auditor is looking at the case before them, the evidence that they're presented with, and they're saying, if we just look at this evidence, is this evidence acceptable to show that the regulations were honored? And you agree that we can do extra testing that's not documented.
yes.
Okay, good. I wanted to get to a clear yes on that. So, what that implies is that we can do the test process that the law requires, and we can also do an extra test process on top of that that the law does not require, but the law also doesn't prohibit. Okay, then the next question is that I always get from uh, clients is why? Why would you want to do two test processes? And then I come with my second point, which I need to check with you as well. And my second point is the reason that you want to do extra testing on top of the the testing that the auditor looks at is that the product may have a bug in it that you don't otherwise find with the process that the auditor looks at. And that bug, if it gets into the field,
Mhm.
may lead to a very expensive product recall. And in that case, the auditor is not in trouble, right? Am I right about that? Does the auditor get in trouble? Does the auditor have to take responsibility for a problem in a product that the auditor has audited the process of?
I don't think so, unless the auditor was conspicuously negligent. But that's really another matter. It would be the responsibility of the management.
Right. So, I mean, you could even talk about the scenario of the testing that was used as the basis for releasing the product was perfectly adequate. No, no problem was found in it. They just didn't happen to find a certain bug. No test process is guaranteed to find every bug.
No, so long as the risk analysis was appropriate to make sure that, or so that people could be confident that with the knowledge they had at the time, they were doing appropriate testing.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Mhm.
So that means that if what we do is test only to please the auditor, we're only doing half of what the business needs. The business needs us not only to satisfy the auditor in regulated software, but we also must produce a product that helps our business succeed and not fail, which is a separate
I,
thing.
I would be extremely unhappy if I thought that people who are being audited were doing something to please the auditor, to satisfy the auditor. That
Oh, I think that happens a lot though.
it does, but it leads to misconceptions about what auditors require. If they should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, because the risks justify it, because they're testing to see if the right controls are in place and working. If they're simply doing it to try and keep the auditors off their back, then I'd suspect that they're not going to be doing the job properly. They've lost sight of what they should be doing, and I would be expecting to find all sorts of issues.
In
I
your
think it's completely the
experiences,
wrong approach.
in
After 2008, James, I remember you talking about the perspective that the at least the British auditors took in the financial crisis. Their response to uh, their approaches for auditing companies. Can you speak to that? Do you remember the? Do you remember what you said?
Not particularly. Are you talking about external or internal auditors? Because that was the big financial crash, which rightly brought a lot of criticism about the inadequacies of the external audit profession. Um,
It had
I'm not
something to
sure.
do with principles based versus rule
Oh,
based.
yes. Yeah, the internal audit professions, the Institute of Internal Auditors and ISACA, especially the IIA, their standards are principles based, which means they're much more flexible. The technology can change, but the principles don't, and it's much harder to fake the testing when they're based on principles. Um, if, for instance, if you're doing a system audit, it's quite likely that you'd be applying the American auditing principles defined by AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, who defined, it was really interesting the way they defined their auditing standards, which wasn't to apply some sort of theoretical top-down approach, but they built on the way that good auditors were doing good system auditing out in the field. And they pulled that together into a model. And that they, in fairly simple, brief terms, they set out how system auditing should be performed. And one of the key categories is processing integrity. And that's a defined term with there are 5 criteria that auditors are looking for: completeness, accuracy, authorization, timely processing, and validity. That gives it doesn't say anything about the technology. It doesn't say anything about how auditors would actually document their testing, but it's a really useful starting point because you're thinking about these criteria when you go in to do an audit, and you're identifying the crucial functions, and you're focusing on what must happen, what mustn't happen, the always events and the never events, and you're asking at each stage where are the controls to ensure that the right things always happen, looking at these 5 criteria. And it's a very simple approach that helps you cope with all the detail. And if a system's really poorly designed and built, it's quite easy to flush out fundamental problems with it, taking that simple approach. Once you've worked through this by this approach, speaking to people, you've then got an idea of how the system's supposed to work to meet the purposes for which it's required. And you can then dive into where you think it might be the most interesting, the most vulnerable areas, to see whether you can break the system, to see if the controls that should be there are actually present and effective. You're not doing a full set of testing like a tester would, because it's much narrower because you're focusing on the real high risk areas where you think there might be problems, when people have not been able to give convincing answers about what controls there might be in place. But going back to what you were asking, that's principles based, whereas what the ISO were offering with 29119 was a really prescriptive set of documentation so that people could go through a testing project and churn out hundreds of pages of shelfware. You could comply with that standard without doing anything that was useful, because it wasn't clear about the principles, the underlying principles of testing, understanding what the purposes of the system were, understanding what the purposes of testing are. And that was why I got so worked up about the 29119 standard, because it was completely misconceived, fundamentally misconceived. And it would have been far more valuable if they'd taken the sort of approach that the internal auditing profession had done. Uh, and I think a big difference was that they'd seen what was being done out in the field, and they built on the best work that was being done out there, instead of trying to impose a rather artificial documentation standard onto good testers. It was completely arse about face.
Well, that 29119 standard is a piece of junk. And the only
Yeah.
thing that saves it in my mind is that no one ever talks about it or thinks about it that I ever come across in all the years since it's come out. I don't think I've had a single
It was so
client talk to me about it.
it was so bad that it's not been a problem,
Well, about a
because
thousand
when you price
testers
it for
signed a
what it is.
petition against it when it came out. Uh,
And for B-roll stuff, I would say this that James Christie, our community rallied against the 29119 standard, which was rules based rather than principles based. What was wrong with that?
Yeah, what we did with 29119 was worthwhile because all the fuss we made and everything that was written, it meant that when people went Googling for 29119, as well as the official stuff from ISO, they found all the criticism too. So that gave them ammunition to justify not doing the wrong thing. They could go to their management and say, look, these are the arguments against it. And I still think that 29119 is a potential danger. Um, just a few weeks ago, something arising out of my work in the post office, it was a proposal I saw for introducing regulation of IT in the UK. And it did mention 29119 as something that should be expected. And that was just because people had gone looking
Oh,
for it. And, oh, that's an ISO standard. And I insisted it should be taken out. And
oh, well,
and it
good
was
for you.
removed. And that it was removed before that proposal was submitted to the government. And
So
because
in your experience, do you see people working to rule? Do you see them just have you been an auditor and come in and see that the people doing the work are clearly just trying to write down some words and follow the words without engaging with the spirit of software testing, the spirit
yeah,
of
yeah,
the critical thinking process?
yes, but in fairness to testers, it's less often the testers who are the problem. It's their management. They're not being given they're not being given the opportunity to do effective testing. They're they've been boxed into a tight testing window, and the test manager is expected to manage a defined testing process. They're expected to go through the motions on time, not cause trouble, and not interfere with the implementation express.
Well, speaking
It's
of
seldom
going
the
through the motions, it seems to me the technology of managing motions is has come a long way. That is to say, the kind of process imprisonment in the open air. You're in a prison, but it looks like you're not in a prison. Uh, this is exemplified by how companies tend to use Jira, where instead of testers being told, here's a part of the product that's been released, test it, investigate it, test it. Instead, they're told, go to the Jira ticket, which has the user story, and attach your test cases to that story. They see themselves as going from Jira ticket to Jira ticket to Jira ticket, dealing with stories rather than seeing themselves as testing a product.
Mhm,
And the nature of Jira means that you can atomize a process into these tiny little disconnected chunks, and it will efficiently hold everybody to satisfying what each one of those little atoms tells us we have to do. And nobody ever, not only do you not need to pull back and look at the big picture, you are specifically prohibited from doing that if
yeah.
you faithfully follow the JIRA oriented, atomized
It,
process of story based testing.
it's defining the job to be one that can be managed by Jira. It's
Yeah,
get it the
it's a
wrong way
sort of
around. And I mean,
instrumentalism.
that mindset was there before Jira. Jira is just the current manifestation of that problem.
Oh,
It's always been there when people have been building big software systems because the natural thing is to look for an oversimplified way to manage it and then define the problem to fit your management system?
Well, I'll tell you what it was like in the 90s. I remember I was there. Uh, and
I could,
actually, the late 80s, when I first showed up, it was the same way. And that was that each company and largely each group in each company would create its own process. Now that might it might take that process from IEEE standards and try to copy an IEEE kind of approach to test cases and test procedures and all that. But for instance, when I joined Apple Computer, uh, every group could decide for itself what kind of system it was going to use. Was it going to use an online system or a well, it wasn't really online in those days, not at Apple anyway. It was, but it was document oriented. We had document templates that we used, and we had a vocabulary of terms we would use, and we would have certain kinds of meetings and review meetings and milestones because somebody had come up with a set of typical milestones that we go through. But the thing that I experienced in that is that as a manager in that process, I could say anyone could say, but especially managers could say, how about we do it a little differently? How about we do this instead of that? And then people would shrug and go like, okay. But then if you had a company-wide system, it was a lot harder to change that.
yeah,
But now with Jira, it isn't a company-wide system. It's an industry-wide system that if you decide I don't want to do it in the Jira oriented way, well then congratulations, you're going to have to develop your own software that rivals Jira. You're going to have to you're going to have to set off an earthquake. You're going to have to reject all this stuff and do something with wikis or something. And that's a huge deal to say to people, I want you to stop using Jira. We're gonna use a different way. So in practice, either it doesn't happen or usually the best I can do with a company is to say, let's use Jira, but let's use Jira in a different way. And we try to have the same kind of thing, but with different content and different expectations, but with the same fields and maybe even the same forms that they've been using all along. But we just privately interpret those forms differently. So Jira is this kind of mothership that's hovering over the entire industry that we can't ignore. That's the impression that I get. And it casts a shadow over every process that we follow. Do you
um,
agree?
uh, yes, yes. Um, I don't have particularly strong views on Jira itself, but it's it's always been a prevalent problem, I think. Well, over the last 20 years or so.
What Michael and I preach is agency. The core of the rapid software test methodology is agency, human agency.
Mhm.
So what we say is that every tester must be responsible for their own process. Everyone who is a so-called responsible tester must be accountable for their own process. And this, unfortunately, feels like it requires testers to stand up against processes that they don't think are helpful. And that's a lot to ask of a tester.
Yes. One of the frustrations I had moving from being an IT or having been an IT auditor and becoming a test manager was that I found test managers could be sidelined and ignored. Whereas if things are being done wrong and you're an auditor, it's your job to point that out and to keep pointing it out. You cannot be told to shut up. It's your job to keep speaking.
Who is
Uh,
sidelining the test managers here?
Pardon?
Who is sidelining the test managers here?
It would usually be project management, program management, or possibly even user management.
And on what basis are they doing that? In your experience, what prompts a program manager to make, I think what you earlier classified as daft claims or daft advice?
If they're not taking sufficient notice of the risks that are posed by poor quality, they're not willing to do, if bugs are thrown up that aren't actually covered by the requirements. Some developers and their management can be much too focused on the requirements and can dismiss bugs or, or especially usability problems that aren't actually inconsistent with the requirements. The test manager can see a problem and the developers will say, well, no, because that's what we've built was consistent with the requirements. I've having worked as an auditor, I've always regarded the requirements as being the best guess about what is required and not holy scripture.
Now, you're speaking here of the requirements documentation rather than the actual requirements of the product.
Right, yes, yes.
Well,
Um,
that's what V and V stands for. I don't like the idea of verification and validation. I think it was a completely unnecessary thing in the history of engineering to say, "Hey, let's talk about verification and validation." Because whenever I hear that, what I go is, "You mean testing?" I have one word that means verification and validation, and the word I have is testing because testing means both of those things. Why didn't we just say testing from the beginning? However, there's one good thing about V and V, and that is when you get people saying, well, the written requirements say this, and we have a test case that shows that that requirement is fulfilled, we can say, oh, you're talking about verification, but verification is not the only V. We
mhm,
have a second V called validation. And validation is the the question, did we solve the problem for
mhm,
the customer, for the user? Did we actually solve the problem? Verification was focused on the immediately preceding specification, and
mhm,
validation is the entire end-to-end uh, truth of it. So although I don't like talking about V and V, I'd rather just say testing. The nice thing about V and V is it does break out validation and remind people in the case where they're overly focused on documented requirements to the exclusion of everything else. We have to solve the problem for the user.
So I've seen test processes which instruct the testers to define test cases based on requirements and only based on the formal requirements, and which I think is
So they're interested in
outrageous.
verification and not validation then.
Yes,
Yeah. Well,
that's hopeless. That's not
yeah.
testing. That's just going through the ritual to try and demonstrate that you're following the process without questioning whether or not the process is actually helping you
Well,
solve the business problem.
you know the old uh, joke is that the old joke about what an actor needs to do is to convey sincerity, you know. So if you can fake that, you know, you win.
Mhm.
And so all you have to do is fake the sincerity. And so somebody could say, well, if you can run a process which successfully displaces any blame for anything that goes wrong onto somebody else who's not you, then you win. You know, any executive can be completely incompetent as long as they avoid blame for being incompetent, then they win. Then they'll be successful all of their days.
Right. I mean, this is where good internal auditors can step in when they see this going on, when they see people who are acting perfectly rational from their own fairly narrow perspective, but doing things that are causing problems down the line, because that are going to cause problems
Yeah.
ripping through into other systems that are going to cause problems when the development team have long gone.
I'll
The
give you an
auditor.
example, a real example. I
Mhm.
was testing a medical device project, and we were using the 60601 electrical medical device testing standard, which, by the way, I respect that standard. It's the only testing standard I've encountered that is lovingly crafted by professionals to help you do a good job. Is the ISO 60601 series of standards for electrical medical devices, right? Okay. So I'm using the standard. I heard that we have to use the standard. It's obvious we have to use the standard because we're producing an electrical medical device. But there are different versions of the standard, James Christie. So which version do I choose? I choose the latest version, version 3, the third edition of the standard. I find out a few months into the process. I'm having an argument with a developer about what's required by the standard. And the developer says the standard doesn't require this. And I say, yes, it does. It's right here. And they say, you're using the wrong version of the standard. We are using the second edition of the standard. And the second edition of that standard was scheduled to be officially obsolete 6 months from the time we were having that conversation. And the development staff had settled on using a standard that by the end of the project would be obsolete. And we would
Uh-huh.
then be judged based on the third version of the standard. And naive me, I'm thinking, well, therefore we have to work to the third version of the standard. Whereas the developers were apparently thinking, let's work to the second edition of the standard and hope nobody notices because it's easier to meet the second edition than it is to meet the third edition. And maybe we can slip under the wire.
Right. Yeah. I can imagine why a test manager could be told to sit down and shut up. We're going with the second version. But you can't take that line with the auditor who objected. I mean, a crucial thing about IT, well, internal auditors in a well-structured organization is that they're immune from pressure from executive management. The reporting line should go up to non-executive directors on the board. At least in the UK, I hope it's similar in North America, which means that when executive managers threaten you, you just smile and ignore them because they've got no clout over you. They can't tell you to shut up. If they want to escalate to pull rank over you, they've got to go to a ridiculously high level outside the executive structure of the organization. And that's quite liberating
Well, in the
when you know.
90s, the standard advice was that testers need to have a reporting chain that's independent of development that goes all the way up to the level of the business. And testing management should not be reporting into engineering management because otherwise you will not get fully independent, robust software testing. And
I'm not
then
sure that.
Agile happened. And as part of Agile, the people who created Agile argued that we don't need independent testers. We can do everything ourselves. We don't need an independent voice. And for that reason, I think CTOs and CEOs and COOs, the C staff, is not getting a clear picture
Yeah.
about the status of their products anymore, because they're dependent on the development team reporting on itself.
I don't think that's a problem only with Agile. I think I've seen that time and again in more conventional environments because it's a much simpler way to manage. It's a very uncomfortable for senior IT executives to let the testers out of their control. I'm wondering if that's going to change in the UK, because you obviously know about the post office scandal that I've been heavily involved in, and that's really penetrated through to the government. And I think there could be a change in the law in England and Wales, possibly throughout the whole UK. And I think that'll have implications for testers and
Well,
also for auditors.
I've read about it, and I saw the television show, and I was hoping to see you as a character in the television show, and they didn't. They cut you out.
Right, right. See,
It was a fascinating television show, an absolutely monstrous situation,
yeah,
monstrous. You know, people
yeah,
died
yes.
because of horrible quality problems that were well known
Hmm.
to the company that produced this software. And they lied about it and lied about it and pushed off blame to innocent people, many of whom went to jail. They jailed their users instead
Yeah,
of admitting that there were bugs in this product. So I delved into, to use a an AI term, I delved into the the legal documentation, the legal testimony about this, and I was shocked to see that there is testimony that that says that the government representatives, the testers for the government, they were aware of irregularities in the way this thing was being produced,
yeah.
uh, from a very early stage. They expressed
Yeah.
concerns. They tried to get these concerns met, and the people, was it Fujitsu? Is that
Yes.
yeah,
The
Fujitsu just said the contract says we don't have to cooperate with you. We don't have to cooperate. We don't have to tell you. The contract says, and so
ah,
the people
yeah.
accepting the software on the behalf of the government apparently had no power to
It
say
was
back to this people producing the software that, hey, that's not going to fly.
James, could you outline to me the the Great Post Office scandal and the work that you did, your role in that story for the testing community, at least?
well, I've been involved in work relating to the post office scandal for the last 5 years now. It's been my main focus of interest, and that followed on from the civil court cases in London, um, when the post office users who'd been victims of this, who'd been prosecuted or jailed, banded together, and we were able to bring a case that proved that the Horizon system was flawed. And this story goes back fully 30 years. The post office in the UK contracted with Fujitsu to develop an accounting system. There's quite a complicated backstory to it, but a major part of the problem was the contracting model. It was something called PFI, the Public Finance Initiative, which was intended to be used for physical infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools. And the idea was that the contractor would build the infrastructure, and instead of the government borrowing the money, the private contractor would borrow the money, build the asset, and then lease it back to the government for 40 years at an extortionate rate. But it kept the public borrowing figures looking good in the short term. This was used for the development of Horizon, and Horizon's stance, sorry, Fujitsu's stance was that they owned the system. They were building it, and all the post office testers had a right to see was the output. It was their job to check that the output was correct. And Fujitsu fought back hard when the testers wanted to see what the detailed requirements were. They wanted to see how it was going to be designed. They were told, no, you've only got a right to see the output. You must regard the system as being a black box. And the post office testers rightly suspected at the time, and it's been proved in hindsight, that Fujitsu had no idea about accounting principles. They were wildly incompetent. They, instead of building a system properly, they'd taken their sales prototype and hacked that into shape and then produced their detailed design documentation by reverse engineering from the code. They'd focused relentlessly on the happy path, which is something that the post office testers were complaining about. Fujitsu wouldn't give serious consideration to failure scenarios about what might go wrong, how it might go wrong, what the consequences might be. In effect, the detailed requirements were being driven by the defects that the post office testers discovered, which is a crazily inefficient way to go about development. And the post office testers, of course, didn't have detailed requirements to work to. They would just flag up a series of problems and they'd get fixed. But there was no serious thought given to underlying design problems. The the two phrases that were used at the time were over the wall was being used constantly. The developer teams are just throwing stuff over the wall to the testers. But it was a fix on fail approach. And the phrase that was actually used and surfaced at the public inquiry was it was an end of pipe approach to quality. And the post office test manager was asked about this at the inquiry because it's a phrase he had used in the late 1990s about Fujitsu's approach, this end of pipe approach. And the attorney, the lawyer who was questioning him, said that implies that it's like effluent that was flowing through a pipe and then was just being discharged into a river rather and then the effluent was being treated rather than any effort being made to stop it flowing through the pipe. Is that a fair description of an end of pipe approach to quality? And the test manager said, yes, it is. That's what we meant. And so the post office testers never really had a chance. They were just constantly firefighting, flagging up problems, but they were ignored. The Fujitsu were contractually obliged to produce a system that would deliver reliable prosecution evidence for criminal prosecutions. In the detail of the contract, there was actually a requirement that the system would have to be free of defects, which is an nonsensical requirement. And Fujitsu got that amended. They said their response was, we will demonstrate that it is working as intended. But the contract as written said they would have to be able to demonstrate it was free of defects. However, the accounting part of the particular part of the system that was to do with cash handling and accounting was so riddled with errors in the pilot that instead of free of defects, the post office said that they'd accept a 0.6 error rate per week across the whole network. And they're talking about 15 or 16,000 outlets. So that's about 100 branches a week being out of balance, which is pretty significant when the branch is concerned. The users there are liable to be held criminally responsible for the deficits, which may simply be system problems.
Well, it's very common in the industry that even large, powerful companies will contract out for software and then they accept absolutely disabling contractual terms. They get completely bamboozled by vendors who the vendors give themselves all kinds of leeway that these big, powerful companies that are purchasing, they don't have to accept these contracts. They could negotiate a much more favorable contract. But once you get into this contract, you're stuck and you
Well,
have to accept this bad software.
the the contract did require a defect-free software, which is a nonsense, and Fujitsu simply didn't take it seriously and made no effort to develop a system that could come anywhere near that. One of the main purposes of the system was that it had to be able to provide criminal evidence, but that is an extremely tough target. That should be a high bar, but it was never taken seriously. But both corporations, after the system went live, even though they knew the system had not actually been built to that standard, pretended that it was sufficiently reliable for criminal prosecutions.
Well, that's what I meant when I said that if you can displace blame, then nothing else matters. And they may even
Yeah.
think this to this day. Like, if only we had done a better job of avoiding responsibility for all the things that went wrong, everything would be fine. It's only that we got caught that is the problem. They might be
Uh,
thinking about that to this day. That's
they might very well have got away with it because what broke the dam was it was the Horizon Issues case, which is settled at the end of 2019, and the judge, many judges, most judges have no IT knowledge, and they're really rather smugly complacent about that. They don't think it matters. They understand the law, and these grubby engineers, well, they do their thing. It doesn't. We don't need to worry about that. But this judge, he had sufficient understanding of technology to understand what he didn't know, and he listened to the right people, and he focused on what the requirement. He identified the purpose of the system should be, which was uh, assessing whether it was producing reliable evidence, whether it was providing information to the users to allow them to use the system properly. And he ruled that it didn't meet either purpose. And was he shot down um, the submission from the post office, the, who were arguing that it was a reliable system. And the judge said, no, it was nowhere near reliable enough for the purposes for which you were actually using it, not the purposes for which you claimed it was required, but for the purposes you were actually using it for.
but isn't it
And
kind of a Pyrrhic victory in the end because the truth won out, but only after decades. It was decades bringing these people to
but
justice,
yes, but if there'd been a different judge, he might well have accepted the bullshit that came from the post office and
right?
ruled in their favor. I could easily have seen that on the basis of the evidence that was led.
Yeah,
And that would have been all that would have happened would have been, the Trade Press Computer Weekly they'd have carried on campaigning for a bit, but then they'd have been ignored. The whole thing would have
yeah,
fallen out of public attention,
yeah,
and the postmasters, they wouldn't have got compensation. They wouldn't have had their appeals, successful appeals, but
yeah.
because they won that case, they were able to appeal against the criminal convictions, and they've been overturned en masse. And there's still big problems with the compensation process, but at least people are starting to see some money. They've been vindicated.
Yeah, after
Painfully
Herculean
so.
efforts. So it's a good ending in a way, but also it indicates how inefficient the courts are at
Yeah.
at
And
policing this sort of thing.
and a big problem in England is that you've got this presumption that computer evidence is reliable. unless the other side can demonstrate that it's not,
Yeah.
which is ridiculous, but it's something that is the government is now, the new government that came in last year, they've turned their attention to. And they launched a consultation in January, which closed a couple of weeks ago, asking for people to explain what was wrong with the law and to come up with proposals for how the law
Oh,
should be changed.
oh, that's good.
And I was delighted when I saw that. And then the day after this was announced, I got an email from the Ministry of Justice, a personal email asking me to make a contribution to this.
Oh,
So I'd been I'd been agitating away in the background, thinking nobody was paying any attention, but somebody in the government was actually paying attention. And they'd
oh,
made
that's right. Good to hear.
yeah, they obviously made a note that when this when the time comes to address this, this is one of the people that we want their opinion.
All right. Congratulations on that.
Can you help me to understand how a law, presuming that computer software was reliable, got to get onto the books at all?
Yes, well, I wrote a massive article about that because I yeah, I was asking that same question. I wrote the report from the Law Commission, who'd recommended it, and I thought their arguments were really rather weak, and the sources that they quoted to justify it were they didn't really seem to make sense. So I got commissioned to write an article, and I tracked down the experts who'd been quoted by the Law Commission, and I spoke to them and found that the Law Commission had misrepresented them. They'd taken quotes out of context, and these people had been arguing for the opposite. It was three particular sources that argued for the opposite of a presumption of reliability, and their work was taken and, as I say, quoted out of context to suggest that they had wanted the opposite. The reason the Law Commission went for it was because it was much more convenient for the courts, for court administration, if the evidence could simply be presumed to be reliable. And the lawyers, the very eminent lawyers who argued for it, they had no understanding of software. They thought computers were essentially just big mechanical objects, which either gave the right answer or the wrong answer. And if it was wrong, it was immediately obvious. They
Well,
had no
it's they
idea.
can be forgiven because they all are from 1958 and got all their information from science fiction movies, I'm
You're
sure.
much,
They
you're much,
they couldn't be people who lived in recent times. They must
you're
have
much.
been people from the olden times if they thought
No,
that.
I checked them out, the people who are on the Law Commission who produced it, and they were not old enough to have had that excuse.
And what
Uh,
was that year, James?
sorry?
When did that law go on the books?
It was effective from 2000, but the report on which it was based was written in 1997. So if by then the big banks and insurance companies in the UK had massive distributed systems across the whole UK, computing was a big deal by then.
I
It wasn't.
remember. I think I remember computers in 1997. I think we did have them. So,
Yeah, you had massive mainframe systems. It's quite different from now, but it was a big deal. Systems were massively complex. The fact that they've got even more complex in the last 30 years doesn't mean it was trivial stuff back then. And they wildly misunderstood what they were dealing with. They were too ignorant to understand the vast expanse of their ignorance. And um, yes, so they misrepresented the experts, and the politicians just took their advice at face value. And so I wrote the article. It took forever to get it through the editorial process for the legal journal because legal lawyers are incredibly pernickety, fussy about wording. They're terrified of getting sued, understandably, because that's what they do.
Even more
Uh,
than auditors.
yeah, and because I was basically accusing the eminent law commission of dishonesty, they were really rather touchy about it. So
yeah.
uh, it took months to get through the editorial process. I was up to about version 24, by the time it eventually got approved and published. But it was worth
Okay.
doing because it was noticed.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess we've reached pretty much the time that we've allocated for this. So, is there anything else you want to say, James?
Well, I think that any reform in the UK is likely to have an impact on the work that testers do, because I think that a change in the law will mean that there's more serious attention given to the way that software is developed, the way it's developed, the way it's tested, and how it's managed. And I'm hoping that that'll have positive implications for testers. It could go wrong if people looked for easy answers like ISO 29119, and
Yeah.
the data I'm concerned ISO might push for that. But this is it's going to be a continuing problem regardless of how the law goes, because the way that technology is moving with artificial intelligence and possibly quantum computing, testing is going to have to change to cope with that, the way people go about it. And I'm hoping that we'll get back to what you were mentioning earlier, that testers will become more independent,
Oh, that's what I'd like to
because
see.
producers of software might have to demonstrate that they've done it responsibly and that the testers have had the chance to be listened to.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, James. Thank you, Michael, for participating in this.